I'm glad everybody's here this morning. If you brought your Bible, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 8 this morning. We're going to look at verses 6 through 13, then if time allows, then we'll get into chapter 9 as well. I hope that you've been reading along. We're not taking too much time to read through things. Reading on your own will help continue to keep you fresh with what we're looking at. So kind of what we ended up with last week was with this section, this theme, this overall theme. So chart all the way from chapter 8 until chapter 8 verse 6, all the way till chapter 10 verse 18, you've got this theme that Jesus is the superior high priest. And the Hebrew writer is kind of breaking it down for us in some way. So there's a sub-theme that we enter into with this, and that's 3 reasons for a new covenant. So this is, he's kind of picking up where he left off. So he talks about a point, drops it off, goes somewhere else, comes back to that point. So we're kind of doing a lot of mixing and matching here, but I hope that it'll be something for you. So we left off last week with verse 6. With this sub-theme of 3 reasons. So this first reason that Hebrew writer gives us in verse 6 on why Jesus is superior in terms of his work is because his work, his covenant, is based off of better promises. So I wanted to do just a quick recap for everybody. One thing I did not do last week that I'd like for us to do, somebody define covenant. It's not necessarily a everyday word for us. That's not unless you live like in a neighborhood covenant. You have a covenant for your neighborhood. That's probably where you will hear it. Most of the time we hear contract or we hear agreement, but there's more to that from a biblical standpoint. Anybody want to define covenant?
It's a divine vessel relationship between one greater and one lesser. And the greater promises the lesser better things that the lesser cannot always do.
Yes. So if you didn't hear Adam, one of the things that makes a covenant the way that it is, biblically speaking, is that the parties are not equal. They are not equal in their standing. It is not one, it's a superior or it's a greater making an agreement with a lesser. And in this case, you have God, who is always going to be the greater. He's going to make an agreement. He's going to make a contract. Again, our terms are falling short in the way they need to describe kind of what's happening. But that's one way to look at a covenant in terms of its distinction, that it is a greater, being able to make an agreement with a lesser. Anybody else want to define what a covenant would be? Any other thoughts on that? Because I'm going to use this word covenant. So it's something that I know we're not accustomed to doing. So I wanted to take just a moment for us to wrap our minds around that word.
A promise.
Okay, so it would be a promise. So it is based on promises. So a covenant isn't just simply a contract. I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. But it has at its core promises. So if you're taking notes, one of the things you'd want to go back and see or right in the margin of your Bible is Hebrews chapter 6, where God makes his agreements with people based on, he makes promises, but his promises are not signature based, they're name based. It's based off his character, based on the fact that he cannot lie, things like that. Adam?
This type of agreement also requires a sacrifice. It is a blood sacrifice.
Yes. So one of the things that makes the biblical covenant stand out is that, again, there are no signatures. What makes it, what ratifies it, what puts it into effect, and we'll see this part in chapter 9, is that someone must die. Something must die. And it is a blood-required sacrifice. The Hebrew writer will kind of moving from a covenant to a testament or a will. Is kind of how he'll describe that. So a will go into effect only when the person passes away. We'll get into detail with that. But this covenant is going to be based on that. So all of this, I just wanted us to have a good working knowledge because we're not going to take the time to really go back in that. So make sure you do that. So Hebrews 8 and verse 6, reason 1, there are better promises. This is why Jesus mediates a better covenant, a superior covenant. This is why his work as the current high priest, because it's enacted, it's based on better promises. So verse 7 and the first part of verse 8, this is kind of a subpoint. And this is what the Hebrew writer says. If that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. But he finds fault with them when he says. So who is at fault? Notice what he says. He says, who is, I already give you the answer. So humans are at fault. I'm ahead of myself. But what makes humanity at fault? He finds fault with them.
They broke the covenant.
Okay, they broke the covenant. So specifically, who was it that broke the covenant? Adam did. So there's really, you've got two covenants in play here, or three if you want to go. You've got Adam, then you've got the Noahic covenant, and then you've got the one made with Abraham, which becomes the Jewish, which we know as the Mosaic Law. So I didn't put that up there, but if you want to know, by the time you get to Moses, after Exodus 19, there are three covenants in play that come in. So you've got Adam, you've got Noah, just that we remember that covenant's still made, right? God still makes that promise that he's not going to flood it. Abraham, he makes that covenant, and then of course you've got Moses. So you've got four overall. But what makes them at fault is the fact that humanity broke it. But what's interesting is that what the Hebrew writer is going to say, because he's going to turn into the Jewish part of it. So let's read this covenant. This quote comes from Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 31, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. What's interesting about Israel and Judah, and where he goes specific, is the fact that he mentions a divided kingdom. So one of the things that God is going to say, what makes Israel, what makes the Jewish people at fault. Remember, he's stopping here at the covenant, so we're not talking about Abraham or Noah or Adam at the moment. What makes the Jewish people at fault for the covenant is the fact that they're divided. A divided kingdom. I will make a covenant with the house of Israel, and I will make a covenant with the house of Judah. Their division is an external sign of their unfaithfulness. Never really caught that before. Why is he going to make a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah? Why not just say Israel? Why not just say Abraham's people? Why not say, do you ever notice that before? I didn't notice that until studying going a little bit more in depth. Israel and Judah's division proves what has always been there from the very beginning. Unfaithfulness. It isn't just the fact that they broke the covenant, it's how they broke the covenant. They were unfaithful to the covenant. And how early back, when did we first see Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant that God made with them through Moses? Well, we see it in the desert, but how far back even before the desert? What are they doing when Moses is getting the commandments? They're worshiping an idol. So even before the beginning, their unfaithfulness is there. The division is a worse part of their history. But all it does is manifest their unfaithfulness that's been there from the very beginning. Why are they at fault? Because no matter what God says, humanity is always going to be unfaithful. They will never keep their end of the covenant. Adam.
He told him he said, when you came out of Egypt, you brought your idols with you.
Mm-hmm.
So they were unfaithful even before they left Egypt.
Yes. Yes, they were. And if you look, like he says in verse 9, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant. Even then, God is looking from the very beginning, you didn't do this. Now think about that for a moment. From the moment they crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, from that moment, it is an up and down. It's a cycle of faithful, unfaithful, faithful, unfaithful. Sounds familiar too, doesn't it? Sounds like a lot like us. We're faithful, we're unfaithful. Now contrast this with Jesus. How many times was he unfaithful throughout his 33 years?
Zero.
That's what makes him superior. So it's being contrasted. So the covenant is not just going to be based on better promises, but it's based on the fact that Jesus, his promises are better because he's faithful. There was never a cycle with him. And so he's able to be a superior high priest because Aaron, for instance, he had cycles of faithfulness, and then the golden calf appears and he's unfaithful because he's leading the charge. He's faithful, then his sons are unfaithful. He's faithful. It's just this ending, this up and down. Jesus never goes up and down, and so the better promises are going to be founded or based on who Jesus is. So Hebrews 6 tells us that the covenant is based on the fact that God cannot lie. But it's also going to be based on the fact that Jesus was never unfaithful. There was no division between him and what the Father wanted. So when the church divides, when the church experiences division, like in 1 Corinthians, what is she doing? She is breaking the covenant. She is showing her unfaithfulness. When the church does this, and that's just one example, when the church goes after something else, or she follows another path, or she's doing whatever, what is she doing? She is revealing her unfaithfulness. So Paul will tell Timothy, even when we are unfaithful, he is faithful, because it goes against his nature to be that way. So this subpoint, yes, sin overall is there, sin in general, but what makes humans? Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, at some point they were all unfaithful. Here.
You've made this point 2 or 3 times, and it's right there. It's one of your, but I'd like to hear you say it again.
Okay.
Talk some about the break in Israel/Judah, and
Okay.
how that illustrates their unfaithfulness.
All right. So the whole idea, so all the way back, who was supposed to be the king of God's people? Just from the very beginning, who was supposed to be the ruler? Okay, God was. But God, having foreknowledge, lays down in the law. So you could say this when we covered Deuteronomy last year. He knew Israel was going to request what? A king. So he lays down, remember in Deuteronomy, when the king does this, this is what's going to happen. Doesn't happen for a couple of 100 years, and then under Samuel, God's people come to Samuel, and what do they ask for?
Give us a king like the rest of the nation.
Okay, give us a king, and the reason is, give us a king so we can be like the other nations. We want to rule ourselves because there's a better way. Samuel, your sons are unfaithful. Samuel and Eli both have unfaithful offspring. Samuel, we know we're doing great under you, but we can't trust your family. Give us a king. Samuel takes it personal. God says, don't take it personal. They have not rejected you, but they have. The division was not the physical division of the kingdom first. The division was when God's people divided themselves from God himself. The covenant, Gary, was always meant to be, the idea of a covenant is a greater making an agreement with a lesser. What happens when the lesser comes to the greater and says, we don't want you to be the greater over us anymore?
Okay, I'm with you on that. And where I've got a little bit of a disconnect, it continues. I'm sure you.
No, that's fine. I'm getting there. I just want to take a break. I want you to keep coming.
All right. So, but that disconnect started even as early as leaving Egypt. We
Yes.
just talked about that.
Yes.
But then the nation split apart.
It did, yes.
And I'm reading your words there to
Yes.
say that that's an indication of their unfaithfulness.
Yes. The division started as soon as they crossed the Red Sea.
Yeah.
But when with the straw that breaks the camel's back, for lack of a way of putting it, is when Israel and Judah say, we're going to become divided kingdoms. That it making sense?
Yep.
So the division has always been there. It always was spiritual to begin with.
Well, they were, see, in my mind, and I'm not, this should take this.
No.
In my mind, they were united in their division.
Yes, that is the, yes.
Okay?
Yes.
But this says even their division, they became ununited in their division.
Yes, they did. In their division, remember the first division, all I'm saying with this division to begin with, is all spiritual. They rejected God from the very beginning after the Red Sea. Now, up to the Red Sea, and even through it, the Hebrew writer will say, by faith, they crossed the Red Sea. But the moment they get out of there, Egypt was better. Oh, if we could have fish and melons and water. Remember all the things the complaints that they had. All of this was spiritual. What the Hebrew writer is saying is that the physical aspect was the straw that broke the camel's back, and they were divided ever since. So the spiritual ultimately turned into the physical. And we get it backwards. We think the physical is the first sign of something happening. We think the physical is the first sign of something wrong. The spiritual is the first sign. The first sign of Israel's division wasn't when they asked for a king. The first sign of their division was when they started complaining that their current king, God, didn't provide for them fresh water and food and things like Egypt. And it just was an ugly thing. Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, I'm with you. It's funny, but
Yeah. But it's interesting to me in highlighting this that the Hebrew writer says the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And I never really, to me personally, I never caught that until this week with putting some things together.
I would have to assume that this division that actually came into being did not happen overnight. In other words, this started a long, long time ago, tribe against family against family, and it festered. And
Yes.
it was lingering there and growing as opposed to each one trying to participate to correct
Correct.
what was going on.
Yes. Adam.
When God spoke to Israel for the first time from Mount Sinai, they told Moses, you speak to us, do not let God speak to us. There was division right there.
It is.
We don't want to hear from God. We want to hear from you.
Mhm.
And even today, Moses is revered more than
Yes.
anything else. And so the division was right there clear. We don't want to hear a spiritual God. We want to hear a human Moses.
It is, and that just how does the entire sermon begin? Long ago, in various ways, at various times, God spoke to our fathers.
Right.
But in these last days, He has spoken to us by the Son. There is no mediator. There is no Moses. But this division. So if you're the audience of this sermon, remember the audience. Some have already left. Some are staying good, if you will, staying faithful. The audience, you're on the fence. You're dividing yourself away from the covenant. The same path of Israel and Judah is your path, and if you don't get off of that path, it's not going to end well. Because how did the physical divided kingdom, how did it end for both of them? Captivity. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And which is the worst? Physical captivity or spiritual?
Spiritual.
Spiritual. Especially after the Son has died so that you would be set free. So why divide? So the Hebrew writer is trying to drag along this spiritual aspect, not necessarily the physical. So reason number 2, and he quotes Jeremiah 31 through 34. Could you look at verses 10 through 12 real quick? And according to that quotation of the promise, of the promise of God there, what are the better promises? And there's a couple of them. So look at Hebrews 8, verses 10, 11, and 12. And according to that quotation, what are some of the better promises that you see?
Put them in their mind, write them on their hearts.
Okay.
It's going to be internal.
Okay, it's going to be internal. Compared to, contrast the 2 covenants, Glenn. What Why? What is that supposed to mean?
It was way too easy to leave that old covenant written on the book.
Okay.
Okay, I got, a temptation comes into my mind, let's look it up in the book and see if I can do it or not. No, the new covenant's better than that,
Okay. Yeah. I like how you put it. It's way too easy to leave it in a book or leave it on a scroll because I have a temptation. Let me look. I like your analogy. The other thing is, if I don't want it, what can I do with the book?
Close it.
I can always close it. I can always ignore it. I can always just pretend. I can always do anything. I can just say, I never knew. There's all sorts of things with that. The other thing is who had the responsibility in Israel in passing on the covenant? Priests did. Did everybody even have a copy?
No.
As far as we knew.
No.
As far as we know, there wasn't like what you have. You have multiple copies. Probably, at home you got it on your phone. The family couldn't even pull it out if they were genuinely interested. They couldn't do that.
We have to separate two things. The first covenant was a covenant for Israel, Judah, but not for mankind. The second covenant now includes the Abrahamic promise.
Yes.
Because it includes mankind. Everybody now falls under that second covenant, but not the first covenant. That's why we're trying a better covenant.
No, and that's another reason for it being a better, is that it finally fulfills the promise God made to Abraham.
Right.
In you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. What's interesting, and this is what, Gary, what we've been talking about, kind of that alternate route, Israel served as an experiment for this, for lack of a better way of putting it. And in her, we can find principles of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. We can see what it looks like. So what God demands of humanity now, we can go back to our Old Testaments and see that in real time on what he demanded of Israel then. So what are some other things that you see in verses 10, 11, and 12?
I will be merciful and I will remember their sins no more.
Okay, and I've always maintained that is the most powerful promise in the entire Bible. It is greater than any other promise that you could ever imagine. Here's my question. I thought it was an act of mercy to provide an animal as a sacrifice to begin with. I'm not disagreeing, but wasn't it an act of mercy to provide something in place of the human being? So are we looking at different levels of mercy? Are we looking at a greater sense of mercy? What are we looking at?
That animal didn't provide forgiveness of sin. It
Okay.
provided a projection. It provided a putting off, providing a pushing forward, or whatever you want to call it, where Jesus, our slate's wiped clean.
Okay.
God remembers them no more.
Amen.
And I think we have to remember that to God there is no such thing as time. So he's seeing Christ as the sacrifice even throughout the time period we consider Old Testament history.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the mercy is. The sacrifice was to teach us as mankind about what was going to happen, but it's all together as far as God's concerned.
It is, because you're right. He is outside of time. Only humanity is bound by time, not God, until he binds himself to it when he comes in the flesh. Remember all of this that we talked about. These served as a copy and a shadow of what's to come. Mercy and grace are still under the Old Testament. They're still under the first covenant. Mercy and grace are still there, even in the garden before Adam and Eve are kicked out. Remember, we talked about this. God covered them with skins, with garments of skins. Who killed the first animal? Who made the first sacrifice? God did. And this is to Suzanne's point. From that moment, if he made the first sacrifice in paying attention through the entire system, who do you think is going to make the last one? So an act of mercy in that regard,
But
yes.
that mercy was limited.
That's the,
Because you
yes.
have to go back again and again and again
Yes.
and again.
And that is the difference with it being better. It's not the fact that mercy wasn't available. It's that mercy was limited because it never gave lasting forgiveness.
Nor
It
did
pro-
it give conscience.
Right, and we'll get into that. It couldn't touch the conscience of the person coming. So you and I are under a better mercy, a better covenant, not because we have it and they didn't, but because we have something that actually, Tom, like you said, wipes the slate clean. And can you imagine this? And there have been several times I've been asked, even here, well, when God judges us and he's going to pull out the books, what's going to be there? You realize that if you're in Christ, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And he's the only, and this is a side point. Now, I've mentioned this a couple of times. You know why you can't forget your own sins and mistakes and choices? Because you're not God. Only God can forget. What we do is that since we're under Christ, when I have those feelings and those voices and those realities of, well, Elisha, you did this yesterday or 10 years ago, whatever it was, I'm taking myself out from under a better promise. I trust in Jesus more than I trust in my past, of past sins and mistakes and choices. I trust in him more. I trust in his work, not mine. And if you're dealing with those and trying to work your way out, work your way from under feelings of guilt and shame, you're not operating under the covenant. Live under the covenant.
Amen.
It's freedom. What else? What are some other promises? Gary, go ahead.
I'm intrigued by the 11th verse. And I'm going to say some things that I've asked rocks not be thrown.
We got books, no rocks. I can't promise they won't hurt.
It says, and they shall not teach each one his neighbor, for each one his brother saying, know the Lord, well, they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Now, I was reading that thinking, my goodness, considering all that we're exposed to and what's going on, et cetera, has anyone drawn a parallel to their all-knowing to the Holy Spirit?
Nobody that I've noticed.
Okay, and I'm not doing that, but it specifically says that in that kingdom, every one of them is gonna know me.
Yes.
And that you would not say to your brother, know the Lord, because you already know him. You wanna explore that a little?
We can. What are your first thoughts? I know they're all over the place with what that is.
Okay.
There's got to be a bridge with something that Glenn mentioned in terms of verse 10, that I will put it in their minds and I'll put it in their heart. That the engraving is that somehow, first and foremost, this is going to be internal. There's something about it. The law was always external. The law could never, whatever it was, its shortcoming was never to be transpired. It just couldn't, for whatever reason. It just couldn't transpire. It could not be taken from here and put onto here. This new covenant is going to begin internally first, and then it will flow external. Am I making any sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. There's something with that. Now, what that is, everybody's all over the place.
Okay.
The answer is found in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20.
Okay.
But God holds everyone accountable, for they are without excuse. Because what was evident, God has made it evident to them, so they should know me. And that includes all of mankind. We don't have excuse anymore.
Okay.
So that covers that right in their hearts and in their minds.
It could. I know that Paul begins that statement in Romans 1 with the fact that creation makes it evident.
Right.
So for the creation to begin with, leaves humanity without excuse that there isn't a God. There is a God. So what happens after that, the rest of chapter 1, all of 2, and then all the way to 3:23 is how everybody's tried to come to terms with that in Romans. Maybe I'd have to consider that. I'd have to think about that. Anybody else?
The only thing I'd say about that is that the first covenant would be, and you just made a point, the first covenant would have that point as well as the second and the third.
It-
That's been there
Mm-hmm.
for humanity.
And these covenants were different. In the old covenant, God demanded them do things in a specific, certain way, to sacrifice certain things in certain times, to have a whole procedural type of religion, if you want to call it that. It was hard to understand God's mind about some of these things. You look at the Sermon on the Mount, people left after they heard that because they were such hard sayings, because it was so different.
Mm-hmm.
We understood what God was all about, what his heart was about, what he wanted us to be like and
Sure.
be like him. To where that was a different type of covenant.
Yeah, it was, and I'm glad you mentioned that. One thing that I read in terms of understanding is that it was the covenant, the first covenant, and again, Mosaic, that's what I mean, what first covenant, was a lot of externals, smelling, hearing, touching. This one, it seems to be that there's that internal component that overrides everything else. And if you have just this, forgive me for using this word, it's not the best one, but this superficialness of religion, and I using superficial synonymously with external. How easy is it for me to go through the motions?
Oh, it's real easy. It can be, your mind can be left out totally.
Okay. Gary, I think that's one of the things that's going on.
Okay.
Just, I can't answer sufficiently, and I wish I could.
But that's okay. I had the question, I had the thought, you touched on it. I don't wanna hold the class up.
No, it's okay. We're not under a timetable. So, unless we're 6 months and we're still in chapter 8, then we'll probably need to be on a timetable. What I will say with this is going to be as that thread of genuineness, being authentic is the words that we use today. We're still under the thread of going through the motions.
Yeah.
We today we can easily go through the motions. We call it just checking the box. That's what we've heard for 10, 20 years. But everybody, if the Christian faith is just external, if all it is just going through the motions, Jesus did not die for us to go through the motions. Go ahead, Suzanne, I'm sorry.
I think we also have to remember that you were born into the first covenant because you were biologically an Israelite.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the new covenant, the house of Israel there, you choose to be in that covenant. Therefore, it's on your heart when you become a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real difference.
Yes, when you agree to the terms of the covenant.
Then it's automatically the law's in your heart. That's why you're there.
Yes, and that's a good point. That it's the first one you didn't have a choice because you were born into it. Good point. Yes, but this second covenant, we made the choice, whether at 10 years old or 17 or whatever we were when we decided. And baptism was our choice, by the way. This is Paul's terminology in Colossians 2, that it's the covenant that we make. The greater lays down, how do you enter into this covenant? You come through faith, you come through baptism in regard to that. So it's better. One, because it's internal. It's better because you make the choice. I like that. And it gives the idea of genuineness and authenticity. And most importantly, it's better because there's nothing on your record. And as long as we walk in the light as he is in the light, what does the blood do?
Cleanses us from all sin.
So guess what's on your record, even if you've been a Christian for 20 years? Now, what if I leave?
No longer any sacrifice for sin.
There's no longer any sacrifice for sin, and guess what's on my record? Whatever I've said, whatever I thought, said, or done. This is why this word, this is one of the major themes of the entire letter. He's faithful, we're not. But the difference will be, we're going to be unfaithful, but we're not going to wake up this morning and say, I'm going to find ways to be unfaithful. The audience of this letter is, we're literally not sure if we want to continue being faithful or not. And the hammering of the Hebrew preacher, of Paul the preacher, is you better be faithful. You better make that choice. Because if you don't, all of this is no benefit to you. No benefit. So look at reason number 3. Because of the changes. So kind of combining everything. Remember, the covenant has changed. Because the sacrifice, all of this, because of the changes, copies and shadows, what is happening? According to verse 13, what is happening to the first covenant?
Becomes obsolete.
Okay, it becomes obsolete. And what's interesting, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. When did he make the first one obsolete?
What he said.
When he said the promise. And at the cross, what did he finish? He nailed it. And notice what the Hebrew preacher does. And put yourself in his shoes. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The promise is what makes it obsolete because it finally highlights what's wrong. And from that moment in Jeremiah 31, guess what was happening little by little with the first covenant? It was just growing more and more outdated. Till finally you get to Christ and his cross, and what do you do with something that's outdated? You nail it. You nail it and you put it away. And now, but you still have the externals. Remember, you still have the externals. So it's still vanishing, even though the spiritual implications are gone because Christ has died and is now risen. That first one is still there externally until when? Until the temple is destroyed. Because as long as the temple is still there, what can you do?
Practice it.
You can practice it. Right? Even if you don't quite understand it, you can still practice it, which is why the first Christians still go. They're not going to offer sacrifices because they're not under that. That's just what they did. That's part of the national identity. So the way I put it is, here's your first Mac. And then here's your latest one. Which one are you going to use? If you're an Apple person. I mean, you know. But this, in my mind, this is... It's great to have on a kind of just as a show and see how far you've come. Well, why would you want to use that when you have this? Why would we want to bring ourselves under the first covenant? God-given, but it doesn't give us what we need. It doesn't provide us with what we need. But if one is like Jenga, you finally just pull one out, the whole thing does what? Falls apart. So we can't mix and match. We take principles. We have lessons to learn. Romans 15, the scriptures were written so that in them that's the Old Testament scriptures. And even Paul to Timothy in 2 Timothy, the scriptures are able to make you wise unto salvation. It's not just the New Testament he's talking about. The Old Testament is there. It can teach us. We need that foundation, but we don't need it for what they had it for.
When Jesus was on that cross of Calvary, the veil which separates the holy from the holiest severed from top to bottom.
It did.
Not from bottom to top, which means God had nailed that old covenant to the cross. It's no longer valid.
No.
Done away with.
No, it's no longer valid in what it says it will do because it never could.
Right.
It's only valid to teach us. It's only valid today. So we're not saying cut off your first 39. You still need them. We still need them. There's value in learning from the prophets and the wisdom literature and all that. But if we're looking to them to get our way to God, that's not going to happen. So, any questions, comments, observations? All right, let's get into chapter 9. So, if you go in through the first 5 verses, again, we're just kind of taking these blocks with it. What the Hebrew writer is going to do is he's going to pick back up with the tabernacle. So, I want to give you a brief description of the tabernacle and give you a picture. So, I want to stand over here. So this is kind of, I've used this in the Gospel of Mark, but this is kind of a little bit more of an intimate setting. So what would naturally happen is when Israel as a whole would travel, then God decided to stop. And by the way, how did God lead them? A pillar of All right, cloud and fire, right? You know, cloud by and fire by night. So you would have this, God was always present. He was always there. They were always follow his lead. When the cloud or the fire stopped, that's where they set up the tabernacle. So all of the tribes of Israel, all 12 of them, would be on the outside. All right, so all of them, didn't matter who you were just set up outside of it. The priest could go in, kind of just pretend this is an entrance. So you've got, kind of see the image of this smoke. So here's your altar. So here's just where you would make your day-to-day sacrifices. This is where your guilt offering, your Thanksgiving, whatever offering you wanted. By the way, you need to read Leviticus 1-7 to really get a good idea of what's going on with this. So you've got all of this just taking place in the courtyard. The high priest, here by the way, is kind of your washing pool. The high priest would go in once a year, and this is where he would go in. So when Adam was talking about that curtain that was veiled, there are two curtains. One from the outside going in, and then internally there's one as well. So if you were a priest, you could go here. If you were kind of, remember John the Baptist? Remember Zechariah? They were casting lots to see who could go in. Well, that's what he would do. He would go into the holy place. He would prepare everything, and then the high priest once a year would go internally. So this is what he would do. So here's your little priest. He's got his guard. Here's one curtain. Zechariah could go in here, John the Baptist's father. So he could go in here. Here's your lamp that we call a menorah. Here's your table of showbread, right here. Then the high priest, once a year, would go past this curtain, and there was the mercy seat. Okay? So everything's there. But everything is like what you just said. Everything is rigid. You do this at this time, in this way. There are no alterations, and we'll see that in just a minute. You've got your altar of incense right here, where you will offer your incense. Nadab and Abihu, when they go to offer their incense, they offer the strange fire. This is here. So when it says that the fire came out of the tabernacle, when it came out and devoured them, it's not this curtain, it comes out of here. So when they're devoured by the fire, they're in here. So guess what happens if all of that, you don't see it, but Nadab and Abihu aren't coming out the way they're supposed to. What do you think this happens to everybody when they're dragging out their burned bodies? It's a frightening thing. What happened to them? What happened? Moses goes and asks. God says, among my people I will be holy. Aaron, I'll be holy. You got to do what I say. Holiness is obedience, following God. Isn't just simply me doing it. It's because I know he is holy. I know that he is holy. So it doesn't matter if I'm a priest or not. I'm going to offer him what he tells me to offer. Just because I'm Aaron's son doesn't mean that I can just go and do what I want. And we're going somewhere with this. So here's the inside of that. Just another view, kind of, another picture. So the curtain that Adam was talking about that's torn, it's this one right here. And that's our hard stop. So if you'll read the first 5 verses of Hebrews 9, you can read more if you want, but if you'll read those, I won't be here next Sunday, so everybody will go upstairs, but we'll pick up in 2 weeks here. So you got some time to read that. Thank you for being here.